Well, welcome to the campus of Case Western Reserve University in this really nice Tincomville University Center. My name is Joe White. I'm professor of political science and public policy and the director of the Center for Policy Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion of the French presidential and actually legislative elections as well, featuring Professor Vincent Michelot from Institut d'études politiques de Lyon, or otherwise known as Sciences Po Lyon. This is one in a series of elections around the world that have been quite interesting. We probably have we have one to come, I think, in Germany soon. But it's a great pleasure to be able to address this election, partly because we're sort of in the middle of it, meaning that the first round occurred Sunday, and then the second round is to come, and then we have the legislative election, which will have a major effect on the kind of government that comes out of this process. And it is, this is one of an occasional series of lectures called the Global Currents Discussions, that are made possible by the generous support of Ms. Eloise Briskin, and we'd like to thank her for that. I'd also like to thank people who help organize Center for Policy Studies activities, including our Associate Director, Andrew Lucker, and his brother, Stu Lucker, and my assistant, Anastasia Vinisco, and all of you for coming. I was fortunate enough to meet Professor Michelot back in 2011 when he found me in France because he was putting together a program, a book conference on basically the balance sheet of Obama, how Obama was doing. The book actually came out. It was titled Le Bilan d'Obama. And he recruited me to come give a talk in Lyon. And recently I had reason to go looking for him, and I discovered, guess what? He was in the United States on his sabbatical, teaching at the University of Virginia as a visiting professor. I thought, there's something going on in France. I'd really like to get somebody here to talk about it. Vincent's actually here. So I feel very lucky to have the opportunity to welcome him here to talk about the French election and French politics going forwards. Professor Michelot is professor of American politics at Sciences Po Lyon. I think it's important to remember that this is a school, essentially a school of government and public affairs that begins at the undergraduate level, but it's more comparable to the kinds of schools of public affairs that we have in the United States. He has served on the board. He serves on the board of Fulbright France. He's vice president of the Research Council of the Institut des Amériques. He's a frequent commentator on both French and American politics. He has written widely about U.S. elections, presidential power, and the U.S. Supreme Court. And he is currently at work with Rayla Raja of UMass Amherst on a book about political parties in both France and the United States, provisionally entitled Weak Parties, Weak Democracies. He's a graduate of École Normale Supérieure de Saint-Cloud. He holds a PhD from the Université de Provence and an habilitation à diriger des recherches from Sciences Po Paris. In Europe, you tend to need like 2 degrees to become a professor. You can't just do it with a PhD. He has duly earned those degrees and has established himself as one of the leading experts in France, certainly, on American politics, and as just a leading scholar and teacher in the field of international relations, and particularly French-American relations. And it is my great pleasure to welcome him to Case Western Reserve to teach us and talk with us. So thank you very much, Vincent.
Great, many thanks, dear Joe. It's a labor of friendship because indeed it was a great pleasure to have Joe back in France on that conference which became a book on Obama's first term. And Joe contributed a wonderful piece on healthcare policies, which was pretty welcome at the time, still is. And I'm happy to be able to say that, should I? Joe, that we will have Joe back in Lyon next year to tell us what is new about healthcare in the United States and to tell us and to tell our students. Now, this afternoon, I'd like to discuss the recent French elections and the elections to come in the runoff on May 7th in the following order. I'm going to talk to you briefly about the old order. Then I'm going to tell you how that old order has been completely disrupted. Going to go then into what I call the French chaos. And then we might have a few conclusions onto the new order, but let me not be too optimistic. I think we have chaos, but we don't yet have a new order. It all started basically when the French amended the Constitution back in 2000 and made a fateful decision to align the term of the president with the term of the National Assembly. We used to have a 7-year term for the president, a 5-year term for the parliament, and we now have 5 years for the president and 5 years for the parliament. The second major decision that was made at the time, no amendment to the Constitution this time, just ordinary legislation, was to invert the calendar. Had we gone according to the normal calendar, in 2002 we would have had the parliamentary elections first, and then we would have had the presidential elections. The French Parliament decided to invert the calendar and have the presidential elections first, and then the parliamentary elections. Which means that in 2002, 2007, 2012, basically we had exactly the same system. We elected a president, and the French voters, being somewhat rational, every time gave whoever won the presidential election a comfortable majority to govern with in the next 5 years. So that decision to amend the Constitution in 2000 made it impossible for us, technically, to have what we used to call cohabitation or divided government à la française. And we were going to go smoothly, or I would say we were going to slouch into an executive-centered regime where parliamentary elections had become basically rubber stamping the presidential elections, and it was quasi-mechanical or automatic that the newly elected president would get a majority to work with in the National Assembly. Well, this had actually not a stabilizing effect, but a disruptive effect on French politics. Because this kind of sucked the programmatic blood out of the parties, and this was based on a two-party system which was frail to begin with and literally exploded in the last 15 years. The reason is relatively simple. We went from a two-party system, and you're going to tell me, but no, we have a multi-party system in France. But in reality, because of the 2 rounds of the French presidential elections, and because of the necessity to put together a governing coalition in the French Parliament, we've only had 2 types of coalitions anchored either on the right by the Conservative Party, whatever its name may be, whether it's RPR, UMP, or now Les Républicains. And on the left, a coalition anchored around the Socialist Party. So you would have the Conservative Party and then minor parties bringing a few députés that would make it a majority party or majority coalition. Same thing on the left with the Socialist Party. It was a two-party system until the moment when we started moving to a three-party system. Because in the last 5 elections, the National Front, the extreme right party, has never polled less than 20% and more generally at 25%. So we now have a three-party system, and a three-party system which is bizarre because it's a three-party system in which the third party, the National Front, is completely excluded from any kind of significant political representation. That means that a party which polls 20% to 25% in municipal, legislative, European, or regional elections has no power whatsoever, except maybe in the European Parliament, and that's the paradox, because the Front National, or the National Front, is profoundly anti-European. And so the only institution in which the National Front is well represented is the European Parliament in Strasbourg. And it draws actually a lot of its funds from that important representation in the European Parliament. But it uses those funds to attack the legitimacy of those European institutions. This is one of the problems of French politics. A regime in which 1/4 to 1/5 of the voters never get representation. Again, the National Front, as of today, has 2 representatives in the National Assembly out of 577. The largest city that the Front National won in the municipal election is the great city of Béziers, 40,000 people, and the only claim to fame of Béziers is that its rugby team was the French champion 6 or 7 years in a row in the 1970s, when basically rugby looked like Philadelphia Flyers NHL game. The Front National does not govern any major city, does not govern any region. We now have 13 regions. They're all governed either by the socialists or by the Conservative Party. But we have, in effect, moved to a 3-party regime, and we're now moving to a 4-party regime. The old order was also characterized by some kind of a curse. The center always folds. The center never governs. If those of you who are familiar with French politics, and I know some of my compatriots are in the room, know that in the 60s, he was my grandfather's hero. Jean-Luc Canuet tried to make it into French politics and to make the center a reality. Jean-Luc Canuet never made it past a secondary cabinet job. Then the next great hope of the center was Jacques Delors. And Jacques Delors decided that he would actually not run for president. He couldn't face the idea that in France, the center had always folded. And then we had François Bayrou. And again, François Bayrou went up to 17% of the vote in the first round of the presidential elections in 2012. And yet, he didn't make it to the runoff. So there is this idea that politics is either on the left or on the right, but you don't exercise power from the center. Today, we're in a state of total disruption. I am totally perplexed, divided by the fact that at the very same time, on Sunday night, we all breathed a big sigh of relief because Marine Le Pen was not in the lead after the first round. And so we were happy. And at the same time, if you consider that 15 years ago, when Jean-Marie Le Pen's face appeared on our screens as one of the two qualifiers for the runoff, that was probably the most catastrophic event in French politics since the German invasion. Our democracy that day had suffered a deadly blow. Today, we put that blow in perspective and say, hey, Jean-Marie Le Pen in 2002 obtained 16.86% of the vote. Marine Le Pen is at just above 22. So we're now in a situation where it's acceptable that not only would, it's expected that not only would the Front National candidate do well, but that she would qualify for the runoff. And now the expectation is that she's probably going to get at least 40% of the vote, when, remember, Jean-Marie Le Pen in 2002, in the runoff, obtained 18% of the vote, with Jacques Chirac obtaining 82%. The other element of disruption was the fact that for the first time in the history of the Fifth Republic, an incumbent president decided not to run. And an incumbent president who went from being elected relatively comfortably in 2012 to an approval rate of 8%, when in December of 2016, he gave up on the idea of running again. Worse, before François Hollande made the decision of not running, he had preemptively accepted that if he were to run, he would run in the primaries of the Socialist Party, which is completely contradictory with the spirit or the grain of French institutions. This is something that needs to be explained, at least in an American context, that in the Gaullist tradition, the president is above the parties, that the president does not represent a party. And contrary to the American tradition, where after a victory in the primaries, an American candidate to the presidency takes over the party literally and remains the leader of that party during his terms, if indeed he is elected to the White House. In France, you resign from your party in order to run for president, and that's exactly what Marine Le Pen did yesterday. She announced that she was stepping down as president of the National Front, and that because it is a normal gesture. But you can't have this Gaullist tradition and at the same time a candidate who is chosen through a party-organized primary and who comes with the legitimacy of the party and not the unmediated encounter with the French people. And that's, again, the Gaullist tradition of saying a French presidential election is an encounter between a man, de Gaulle never thought that it could be obviously a woman, and the French people, but unmediated, direct encounter. This is also the first presidential election, and I'm coming to this, in which both major parties chose their candidate through a primary. And that had a profoundly disruptive effect. Why? Because the Socialist Party had always had a profound dividing line between what I call, on the left, the protest, romantic left, and on the other side of the line, the government, pragmatist, realist left. La gauche de gouvernement, la gauche romantique, as we say in French. Well, every single Secretary General of the Socialist Party had one job: to keep the two wings of the party together. That job was made strictly impossible by the primary. In a primary, we had Manuel Valls representing la gauche de gouvernement versus Benoît Hamon representing la gauche protestataire, la gauche romantique. And the divide was amplified, the gap widened, and reconciliation was impossible. End result, rest in peace, Socialist Party. Why? Because the pragmatists left the Socialist Party pretty much, and as Manuel Valls indicated that they would be voting for Emmanuel Macron. And as for the protest left, they said, well, we're closer to Jean-Luc Mélenchon than we are to Benoît Hamon. And then comes in something which is difficult to see from our vantage point here in the United States, which is the notion of vote utile. And that's where the transition from a two-party system to a three-party system is very important. In a two-party system, we have a saying, which is, in the first round, you choose. In the second round, you eliminate. Au premier tour, on choisit. Au deuxième tour, on élimine. Except that, in a three-party system in which one of the candidates is an extreme right candidate, and I'll come to the difference between far right and extreme right, which may not sound very important, but it is fundamentally important. If one of the candidates, who is almost certain to be in the runoff, is an extreme right candidate, then there's no debate on ideas. There's no debate on programs. There's no debate on platforms. It's all about choosing whoever is the best candidate to face Marine Le Pen in the second round. And then also, mechanically, the two-round system makes it stupid to waste your vote on a small candidate. And, for example, that's exactly what happened to Benoît Hamon. Benoît Hamon, the official candidate of the Socialist Party, started his campaign with the momentum of winning the Socialist primary. And then he made a few missteps at the very beginning of the campaign and started dipping below 15. Below 15, you're not within reach of the second round. If I am a man on the left, I say, well, if I want to vote my heart, I'll vote Mélenchon. If I want to vote useful, I'll vote Macron. But there was no political space, no ideological space any longer for Hamon to occupy. Both parties were fractured by the primaries, but for different reasons. The Socialist Party because it increased the divide and made it impossible for the two lefts to reconcile. The Conservative Party for other reasons. Because the Conservative Party, first of all, went against its tradition. Remember, Les Républicains, even though it no longer has de Gaulle or République in the name, is the Gaullist party. And it's a Gaullist party which had to adopt a system it was profoundly critical of, that is to say, the primaries. And they chose a candidate. And what made it impossible for Les Républicains to drop François Fillon after it was revealed that he had pretty much hired his whole family for a certain number of years to do, we don't know exactly what kind of job, and that François Fillon had a very specific kind of relationship to money. François Fillon could not drop out and would not drop out. Why? Because he had been chosen by the people. He had the popular vote behind him. And because the Conservative Party had given itself rules, that's how we choose a candidate, they couldn't very well say afterwards, oh no, well the party finally decided in a smoke-filled back room that we were going to actually choose the candidate in a different way and that we would replace François Fillon with somebody else. And the primaries also made the conservative candidate on the right, who would have been extremely viable and who would have deprived Emmanuel Macron of political oxygen or space, that is to say, Alain Juppé, non-viable, because you don't run in a presidential campaign someone who's just been defeated, and not by a small margin. François Fillon trashed Alain Juppé in the conservative primaries. The primaries fragmented the Socialist Party. The primaries fragmented the Conservative Party. And then this election was even more disrupted by what I called media determinism. What I call media determinism is simply the fact that we had Brexit, then we had Trump, and the writing on the wall in big black letters was, we're going to have Marine Le Pen. It's inevitable. And if you say, no, there's no way that Marine Le Pen can be the next president, the answer is, well, that's just what you said about Brexit, or that's what you said about Trump. So the idea is, we're going to have Marine Le Pen. And despite the fact that I was wrong on Trump, I will still say that we're not going to have Marine Le Pen. But the whole election was interpreted, especially here in the United States, but to a large degree also in France, as if Marine Le Pen were our next president. Then the one last element which you have to keep in mind is the fact that the traditional divide in France, the most structuring one that we've had, both for voters and for elected officials, was the divide between left and right. Well, the two main candidates, those who qualified actually for the runoff, both attack the significance, importance, or relevance even of the left-right divide. Marine Le Pen attacks that divide in coining a word which she got from her dad, as a lot of other things, which is UMPS, that, UMP, which is the old name of the Conservative Party, and PS, which is the Socialist Party. It's all the same. And for her, it's not about the left or the right, it's about nationalists versus cosmopolitans or patriots. And Emmanuel Macron spent the whole campaign from the very beginning saying the left-right divide no longer applies. I want to get ideas from the left, I want to get ideas from the right, and I don't want to be constrained by old-style politics. Well, this is profoundly disturbing, and my colleague at Sciences Po Paris, Nona Meyer, wrote a brilliant piece on that, is that voters do need ideological markers. Voters need to put candidates somewhere on the map. And straddling the left-right divide, as Emmanuel Macron does, or refusing the very existence of that line and redrawing it in a different manner, and saying it's between nationalists and cosmopolitans, is a way not to help voters make a decision, but it's one way of totally puzzling voters. The result is indeed chaos. And chaos which is characterized first by the fact that the two major parties have been eliminated from that election. That's a story you've heard a lot. But it's also chaos because if you add the votes for Jean-Luc Mélenchon, 19.2%, and the votes for François Fillon, for Marine Le Pen, sorry, 21.3%, you have over 40% of the French population who voted for extreme candidates. Even though they're not the same extremes, and I would be very, very wary in using in the same sentence extreme left, extreme right to speak of Marine Le Pen and Jean-Luc Mélenchon. But those are traditionally two candidates who are on the fringes of French politics. Well, the fringes are more important than the center. Now, this makes the runoff election, the runoff, not the second round of the presidential election, but the first round of a three-round parliamentary election. Why? Because, first of all, you have to remember that the French president is not that powerful. That a French president without a majority in the National Assembly can do practically nothing. Those of us who are French remember that between 1997 and 2002, we had a conservative president, Jacques Chirac, but a socialist prime minister, Lionel Jospin. And no one would characterize this as a period of conservative government. Lionel Jospin and the socialist majority in the National Assembly made all the decisions. That's the period which is associated with, for example, a very important piece of legislation, which is the 35-hour week. It's a period of progressive socialist government. So the president needs a majority in the parliamentary elections. Marine Le Pen will not be the next president because there is such a thing in France as le Front Républicain, the Republican Front, which has been at work most recently in the regional elections. When there was a chance after the first round of those regional elections that the National Front would win in 2 regions, in the north and in the southeast, in both cases, the socialist candidate withdrew and called to vote for the conservative candidate. And in both cases, Xavier Bertrand in the north of France and Christian Estrosi in the southeastern part of France were elected with votes from the right and from the left. And in both cases, the Front National candidate was defeated. The same thing is going to happen on May 7th. But the problem here is that we don't see it that well from the United States because we're not curious enough as to the history of the National Front and the policies of the National Front. And that's where the difference between the far right and the extreme right comes in. Remember, the Front National is a party that was not founded that long ago. It was founded in the very early 1970s by Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marine Le Pen's father. And that's a party which brought together people who had been collaborationists during the Second World War, or who were nostalgic of a period which, after all, was characterized by order. And Jean-Marie Le Pen, in one of his many outrageous and shocking statements, said that, actually, 1941 to 1944, we had order in France. True. That's a party which was founded by people who were nostalgic of colonial France. People like, unfortunately I have to say this, like my grandfather, who never even uttered the word war about Algeria, because Algeria was France, so you don't have a war. So my grandfather spoke of les incidents, les troubles, les émeutes, so incidents, troubles, the riots, but my grandfather never in his whole life uttered the word war in Algeria. This was not a war. This could not be a war because Algeria was France. If you're nostalgic of colonial France in 1970s, maybe it's acceptable. Nostalgia of colonial France in 2017 is a disease. Then, in the National Front, you have people who traffic in Aryanism, looking for the origin of the great race. You have ex-leaders of a movement which is called Groupe Union Défense, which was a fascist union in law schools in the early 1970s. This is a party which has a different origin, a different history, which is outside of the Republican pale. And I have no problem whatsoever, even as a political scientist, describing it in that fashion. There is no comparison possible between the National Front as a party and very conservative Republicans in the United States. The National Front is not the Freedom Caucus. It's not degrees of conservatism. It's crossing a line between a Republican Party and a party which is outside of the Republican pale or mainstream. What now? Well, we will not have a new order. Why? First of all, because the parties are going to make their comeback in the parliamentary elections. There's one thing, it's one thing to run a presidential campaign without the support of a major party. And Emmanuel Macron has just done this. It's a remarkable feat. It's a remarkable feat in a lot of ways. First of all, because as you all know, if you've been looking at European politics, all new political movements in Europe in the last 20 years have been populist, extreme, left or right movements, whether it's Syriza, Podemos, the Five-Star Movement. Emmanuel Macron did something rather extraordinary. He created a new political movement at the center. So that's the first thing. But the problem is very simple. It's organizational, and it's fielding on June 11th and 18th, 577 candidates. When you have a party which has never run into any kind of election. So it's the difference between AstroTurf and grassroots politics. You have to create an organization and, first of all, recruit 577 candidates. Now, you can probably recruit 577 candidates, and there are lots of people now, especially since Monday morning, who would like to run with the En Marche label. Is it in the interest of En Marche to say, yeah, come? History teaches us that you really want, before you recruit a candidate, first of all, to look at his Facebook page. And I'm saying this because that's one of the problems that the Front National is also facing. The Front National is outside of the Republican pale, but it's also a young party. And as a young party, it has had difficulties recruiting candidates. And so it was a little bit sloppy in, recruiting those candidates. And then all of a sudden, because that candidate gets public exposure and is a candidate for mayor in a large city of over 100,000 people, journalists or other activists get interested in what you have in that person's Facebook page. And you discover that, for example, you have a picture of our ex-Minister of Justice, who is a hero of the French left, Christian Taubira, who was the Minister of Justice who pushed for same-sex marriage legislation, which really defined the beginning of François Hollande's term. And Christian Taubira is a black woman from French Guiana, and she is depicted on those Facebook pages as a monkey with bananas. Well, first of all, it's criminal under French law, and we have no First Amendment, and we have no qualms whatsoever punishing this kind of crime with fines and suspended prison terms. But it's also the end of your political career. So, En Marche or the Front National need to be extremely careful in, first of all, recruiting and then vetting those candidates. But then you have to coordinate their message with a platform, and then you have to finance them too. Remember, we have public financing of politics in France, which means that your financing is based on your results in previous elections. since the En Marche never ran in an election, En Marche is strictly funded by donations. And the ceiling on donations is very low. I mean, just to amuse you, for those of you who are not familiar with campaign finance in France, in 2012, the two candidates who were in the runoff, Nicolas Sarkozy and François Hollande, were capped at 21 million euros in campaign expenses. I'm sure you have an idea of what the cost of the 2016 elections was in the United States. So when you say 21 million euros, you say, well, that's a lot of bagels, but what else? So, but in order to run a parliamentary campaign, you also need to finance it. So En Marche is going to have a hard time. The parties will come back. And I just got some inside news from some of my friends in the Socialist Party. So full disclosure, I am a member of that party, but full disclosure, again, I voted for Macron, so that there will be no, misgivings or what just transpired from the Socialist Party is that the Socialist Party does not want Bernard Cazeneuve to run the parliamentary campaign. So there's a lot of infighting. And Emmanuel Macron, who was on France 2 just a few hours ago, declared that he demanded that candidates who run as En Marche resign from their parties. That is to say that someone who is a member of the Socialist Party and an incumbent socialist representative in the National Assembly, but who is favorable to Macron, will have to resign from the Socialist Party in order to run with the En Marche label. Same thing for the centrists, who are members of Les Républicains, who are incumbent representatives from Les Républicains. They will have to resign from Les Républicains in order to run with the label, the En Marche label. It's good because Emmanuel Macron is delivering on his promise to renew political personnel in France, and we have a great need for fresh faces and some renewal, especially after what happened with the Conservative campaign. But on the other hand, it makes it practically impossible for Emmanuel Macron to win an outright majority in the National Assembly in the next elections. Which means that we see the ghost of the Fourth Republic coming back to us. And why do I say the ghost of the Fourth Republic? Because in a way we've come full circle. The Fifth Republic was created in 1958 by General de Gaulle because the Fourth Republic and its parliamentary system made it impossible for that generation to enforce consistent policies on two major issues which faced France in between 1945 and 1958. One is decolonization, and the other one is European integration. We didn't do very well on either one of those topics, but especially on the topic of decolonization, which was an absolute catastrophe from Dien Bien Phu to the Evian Agreement. We had 23 cabinets between 1946 and 1958, high instability, and whenever you say a parliamentary regime in a multi-party system, the ghosts of Guy Mollet and the Fourth Republic come back to haunt you. This is also the reason why, and my students at UVA made this very simple remark, why don't you just change electoral rules? Have proportional representation instead of having first past the post. You would solve the problem that I just, underlined a few minutes ago of having a party which polls 20 to 25% of the voters but gets no representation. This way you would have the Front National represented. Except that in a multi-party system, that would create great instability, greater instability because that party cannot strike any form of alliance with the other parties because it's outside of the Republican pale, and greater even instability because we have now moved from a two-party system to a three-party system to a four-party system. And we have the extreme left, we have the center, we have the conservative wing, and then we have the extreme right. And yet, in order to have a majority in the National Assembly, you need 289 representatives. And 289 representatives, the maximum that one party in a two-party system can get is approximately 240, so you need another 40 or 50 to arrive at the magic number. In a four-party system, you're going to have extreme instability. So Macron is now in search of an impossible majority, and basically that task is predicated upon one thing: his acquiring enough momentum in the runoff in order to gain at least 150 to 200 representatives on June 11th. And that momentum, we all agree, is above 60%. Macron can win at 55%. It's going to be a Pyrrhic defeat of French democracy. Anything under 60% is catastrophic for French institutions. But I'm going to leave you with just one question, which is ironical. We have the death of the old regime, but that death might have been called too early in a way. Because, yes, we don't have an election, we have some kind of an insurrection with French undertones. Institutions matter and history matters. But I would have given a completely different speech, and we would have had a completely different order. And I'll just leave you on this. What if François Fillon had been an honest man? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That talk provided exactly what I was hoping it would provide, which is a background far beyond what you pick up in the usual public press in terms of understanding what the situation is for French government and politics going forward. So we now have a period for asking questions and getting answers. And for that purpose, we would like to record the questions, because we are recording this to post online. And either I or Mr. Lucker over there will bring you the microphone. So, yeah.
Joe, your mic's not on.
Hello? Okay.
Yes.
There was an article in the Wall Street Journal today talking about what you just said about Macron's really has to get a majority of parliament in order to be. Let's flip the situation, given what you've said. Let's suppose Le Pen were elected president. Could she possibly get, could the National Front possibly get a majority in parliament? Do you think that's possible? And then if not, would we have the same scenario that you mentioned happened, I guess, 20 years ago, where you had a conservative president and and a socialist prime minister, and nothing got done, basically, or it wasn't a conservative government?
If Marine Le Pen were elected president, obviously her party would be able to gain up to 150 representatives. But that's the absolute ceiling. It's very difficult to go from 2 to over 120 or 150. Then what would be the most important criterion to determine how large her representation in the French Parliament would be is whether the Front Républicain holds or not. That is to say, whether in those districts where in the first past the post system you have 3 candidates, for example, who qualify for the second round. One of them is the left, one of them is the traditional conservative right, and one of them is the Front National. Whether the Front Républicain holds and you have either the conservative candidate or the socialist candidate withdrawing, making it almost impossible for the Front National candidate to win, or whether that part of the conservative party of Les Républicains, which is now really tempted not to even call to vote against Le Pen, because right now they're debating and they're at each other's throat in Les Républicains, to decide whether they want to say outright vote for Emmanuel Macron, or to say in a more discreet way, vote against the Front National, without mentioning the name of Emmanuel Macron, which makes a big difference. And it makes a big difference to those activists to the right of the party who hate Emmanuel Macron. So it's one thing to say, vote against the National Front, but to tell them, vote for Emmanuel Macron, they might leave the party and align themselves with the National Front. Still, it's almost mechanically impossible with our present system for the National Front to even have a majority within a majority. If she gets to 140 representatives, which no political scientist in his wildest dreams or nightmares can imagine, 140 is still a minority in 289. So she would need 149 representatives in the 140 scenario from the conservatives in order to govern with her. I mean, you can't have 140 representatives from the National Front governing with people who are elected based on a Mélenchon list or a socialist list. So it has to be the traditional conservatives, in which case the National Front would be a minority of the parliamentary majority, which means that the prime minister would not be from the Front National, but would be from Les Républicains. So she would only be able to enforce traditional conservative policies, but not extreme right policies. Then there are a couple of other obstacles that I want to point out. Marine Le Pen, for example, is in favor of what she calls la préférence nationale, national preference, which is also one of the slogans of the Front National, les Français d'abord, the French first. It's not France first, it's the French first. But, well, the French Constitution is very clear. If you're a legal resident of France, it makes no difference whatsoever whether you're a legal resident or a citizen. Which means that, for example, in terms of welfare rights, you cannot discriminate based on citizenship. So when Marine Le Pen advocates national preference, for example, in housing aids, it would take an amendment to the Constitution in order to implement this kind of policy. Taking France out of the euro, out of the EU and out of the Eurozone would probably be only possible if we had a referendum. So we would have a referendum on Brexit. But remember, and General de Gaulle learned painfully about this in 1969, remember, in France, referenda are not about the question. It's about who is asking the question. So, in 1969, for example, the French voted in a referendum on the powers of the French Senate. And as a result of the French saying no to that referendum, which de Gaulle had put on the ballot, de Gaulle resigned. You think the French cared about the powers of the Senate in 1969? That it was like a major issue that was dear, and no. They just sent a message to the great general that he'd been in power since 1958, that 11 years was a long time, that 1968 had gone by, and that it was time to go to Ireland. So, and I'm using that example to say what? That if, and she's announced that, if Marine Le Pen were president, she said, I will call for a referendum on Brexit. Well, that referendum on Brexit is not going to be about, do you want to leave Europe or do you want to remain in Europe? Do you want to leave the Eurozone or do you want to retain the Euro? That referendum will be the third round of the presidential elections. And it will be, the French will not be voting on Europe. They will be voting, it's like going to be a recall vote on Marine Le Pen. And if she ever were to win in 2000 on next May, that would be the third round. And I'm not sure that she would want to start a 5-year term on a referendum that she's far from being certain to win. One last thing, which is I think important. This election is about fear versus hope. Fear in the sense that a lot of the voters who voted for Marine Le Pen want protection from all kinds of destabilizing trends in a globalized world. And so Marine Le Pen has been very good at sharpening those fears, at heightening them, and say, well, I'm going to bring order back, and I'm going to protect you. But one thing is for sure is that, first of all, the French are educated enough to know that we're not bringing mining jobs back. This morning on NPR, I was confirming that we don't have a single operating mine in France. 0, okay? Not 1 or 2. And we're not going to reopen mines in Saint-Étienne or in the north of France. That's gone. We have no hope whatsoever of bringing steel jobs back. They're gone. We're going to fight to maintain a certain number of jobs in the automobile sector, in the tire sector, because that's a French tradition. So that's the first thing. But there is an element which is terrifying about leaving the EU. It doesn't take a PhD in economics to understand that if France gets out of the EU, then the next thing is our debt is no longer labeled in euros, it's labeled in French francs. And that the debt load is going to be much heavier. It doesn't take a PhD in economics to understand that if you leave the EU, then our imports are going to be more expensive because we are going to have tariffs. That's exactly what the British are facing right now. I mean, you can't be out of the EU but have the benefits of the EU. And it doesn't take a PhD in security studies to understand that two crises that we're having right now to face in Europe, the refugee crisis and the fight against terrorism, are not crises that can be addressed by nation states. The reason why the French are highly skeptical and angry at the EU is because they realize that, for example, the refugee crisis is exactly within the purview of not nation states, but the European Union. That there's no Slovakian or Czech or Austrian or German solution to the refugee crisis. There is a European solution to that. And when we had the bombings in Brussels and in Paris, the idea was we need more collaboration in terms of intelligence exchange, not less. And we need to be able to collaborate better between the Belgian police, the German police, the Austrian police, rather than erect a Maginot Wall on the highway between Brussels and Lille. So there is this fear that getting out of the EU might have benefits, but it is also terrifying. And that's where you also see one of the very same line, and that's probably one of the most important similarities between the US and France, of a vote, and there was a very good graph in the New York Times yesterday. Who votes for Marine Le Pen? Who votes for Emmanuel Macron? Marine Le Pen, you have a majority of voters who have at most a high school degree, and most of them are rural, or as we say in French, peri-urban. That is to say, they live in the second tier, just outside of the banlieue, our suburbs. They live outside of the banlieue. That is to say, they're not wealthy enough to live in the downtowns, which is where the middle class and the upper middle class live. They're too wealthy to live in the suburbs, so they live in the third tier of the French territory, and that's what we call peri-urban. Emmanuel Macron's voters are more educated, and they're very urban. In Paris, Emmanuel Macron is at 36%. In rural areas, he's at 15%. And what you see is clearly, on the one hand, people who face globalization with a certain number of assets, and people who have everything to fear from globalization on the other side. But to finally conclude on a long answer to a short, good question, she's very limited if she is indeed elected, not next Sunday, but the Sunday after.
This gentleman had a question.
What are the long-term implications of Le Pen's romance with Putin?
Well, I mean, the thing is, Marine Le Pen is not the only one in France who is trying to get closer to Russia. It's interesting because Marine Le Pen is indeed relatively close to Putin because of the nationalist paradigm. But Jean-Luc Mélenchon, on the extreme left, is also closer to Marine Le Pen, to Putin, than he's to Europe. And then even François Fillon, the traditional conservative candidate, said we have to be very careful. Russia has an old history on the continent, and you can't underestimate how much the French were struck by the election of Trump in the United States. And just one little personal anecdote. I voted with my sister in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And in the line at the French school where we were all voting, there were hundreds of new voters. And as a curious political scientist, I kind of like struck a few conversations. So, no, I've never voted. But the French were saying, after what happened here, we don't want a repeat on the other side. So Trump's election here has had an impact and among the French voters as making it concretely possible that someone of that ilk could get elected. And so it reinforced what we call le vote utile. It's like, be careful, vote utilitarian, vote useful. But to get back to Russia, there is, on the one hand, that sense that we have to live with the Russians, but we also have to draw a line, and that the sanctions on Russia after Russia annexed Crimea are there to stay, and especially if Macron is our next president. There's absolutely no doubt that there will be very little change in the policy towards Russia.
Thank you. What's your expectation about the Social Party after this big clarification that happened?
Well, the Socialist Party
it just was postponed. This is
yeah. No.
Was
I mean, well, first of all, you're asking me to conduct a post-mortem, and I will gladly go into the post-mortem. The Socialist Party right now is in a final terminal state of disintegration because the pragmatists cannot not vote for Emmanuel Macron, support him hard, and yet at the same time, it's very difficult for them to accept the ultimatum that Emmanuel Macron sent this afternoon. Either you resign from the Socialist Party or you cannot run as an En Marche candidate. But at the same time, the Socialist Party has resigned. I have a lot of friends in the party. A few of them are députés. And one of my friends, who happens to be a frondeur, so one of the, on the protest romantic left, 2 years ago told me, I was addressing my friends in the Socialist Caucus, and remember there are 240 of them for the time being, and said, I'm looking at The Walking Dead. Because even 2 years ago, the prediction was that the party would probably lose 3/4 of its representation. At the present time, we're looking at a Socialist Party which will probably elect in between 50 and 60 representatives out of the 240 that it has right now. But at the same time, it's a little bit too early to talk about the death of the Socialist Party. Because one thing, I mean, it's relatively traditional in France with the first past the post system and victories that are just amplified by the presidential election before. The Socialist Party went from 120 to 240, and then it's going to go back to 60. It all depends on whether Emmanuel Macron is able to capitalize on his likely victory on May 7th and pretty much co-opt the right wing of the Socialist Party. And on the left, and that's something nobody's talking about right now, because he has not yet announced whether he would even support Macron in the second round. What is Jean-Luc Mélenchon going to do? What is Les Insoumis, what are Les Insoumis going to do? Over 19% of the vote. So that's 1 French vote out of 5. If Les Insoumis becomes the same kind of political party as what En Marche is trying to become, then there's no political space for the Socialist Party to exist, except as a sect dedicated to the memory of François Mitterrand. But except for those people like, you know, le cercle des poètes ou des socialistes disparus, but except for for those people, the Socialist Party will have no political space to occupy. But remember, again, it's going to be very hard to completely uproot the party, because the party is not just about the representation in the National Assembly. It's still a party which governs a large number of large or mid-sized French cities. It's a party which still governs regions, departments, and which is deeply rooted in local politics, and which has also demonstrated a certain amount of flexibility. The mayor of my city, Gérard Collomb, is nominally a socialist, but he's today Emmanuel Macron's prime supporter. But for the time being, he has not been excluded from the Socialist Party. The difference between the Socialist Party and Les Insoumis, Mélenchon's voters, is that Les Insoumis is a movement which is made up of the Communist Party. Remember, we still have a Communist Party, you know, and other groups on the left. The Communist Party is represented, has approximately 15 representatives in the National Assembly, and this, the fate of those representatives is directly linked to the Socialist Party. Because if they were elected, it's because they entered into an alliance with the Socialist Party. So it's a little bit too early, but the Socialist Party is certainly in dire straits. But then the Conservative Party, right now, if my phone is buzzing with alerts from Le Monde and Le Figaro, the Conservative Party is exploding. They're trying to choose a leader for the parliamentary elections. It's not going to be Fillon. He's damaged goods, and he's dead. It's not going to be Laurent Wauquiez, who desperately wants to become the next leader of the party, but is a little bit too far to the right. It's not going to be Alain Juppé, because Alain Juppé is too old and was defeated. And so it's up to the next generation, but the next generation has not done very well in the primaries. And that, again, where you see that the primaries have had this very damaging impact on both political parties, because a woman like Nathalie Kosciusko-Morizet, who represents the center right, and who is of a different generation, who has a very different approach to French politics. She could be a leader of the party, but anytime she pretends or says openly, I want a leadership role, people tell her, remind me of your score in the primaries. And that's the end of it.
Yeah,
Please wait.
okay. Given the light of what's happened in the last 48 months with the terrorist attacks and so forth, and the refugee crisis, which is primarily former colonies from Northern Africa, or from Africa, or those who are Islamic, what is the remedy to have a whole society, being that it could be a backlash against those who practice Islam, or those who may be from the former colonies? And what is going on within the military? I know some 45 years ago there had to be some fetters placed on the French Foreign Legion in terms of acting autonomously. So what is the result? I know we have these parties who are running as candidates, but is there a problem, or do you feel there will be a state of emergency if this continues? And do you feel there will be counterattacks relevant against African migrants or Arab migrants, or those who are against mosques and other things?
Yeah. I think it's a very interesting and complex question, and I'm going to try and break it down.
Okay.
Because I think that it's highly toxic to speak in the same sentence, and this is not criticism, okay? It's just trying to be as pedagogical as possible. You cannot speak in the same terms of Islam, terrorism, colonialism, and inequality in France. They're linked, okay? Intimately. But if you conflate them and put them together and shake, then what you get is Marine Le Pen. Making easy connections between Islam and terrorism. And it's convenient, because this way, for example, if you make a connection between Islam and terrorism, that allows you to stigmatize a whole group of people. Then that allows you to totally ignore one of the roots or the root causes of the radicalization of a certain number of people in France today, which is the fact that we are a society which failed to deliver, for example, an equal access to quality education. It's a myth. L'école de la République is something that I live by, that I believe in, except that l'école de la République is not working well. That l'école de la République is not giving access to higher education to everybody. And depending on your name, on your origin, on your ethnic origin, you don't have the same opportunities. But once you conflate Islam and terrorism, you don't speak about higher education or primary education or secondary education. You don't speak about something which is extremely important and which the French have not been good at, which is vocational education. Even though we have created shorter programs, 2-year programs in the university, those programs are still frowned upon. And so I'm not setting up the German model of apprenticeship as the absolute model, but we're very far from that. So that's the first thing. Then the refugee crisis is something different again. It's not primarily a population of refugees coming from ex-French colonies. I mean, the refugees in France right now essentially come from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya. Those are the 4 countries which dominate. None of them is an ex-French colony. So you got to separate that, all right? They're predominantly Muslim countries, that's a certainty. And France does have a very special relationship to Islam, which has to do with its colonial past. Simply in terms of numbers, France is the country in Europe which has the largest Muslim population. So that's a given. But the other important fact which we tend to neglect is that France is probably the most secular country in Europe. So when you bring into, and I'm saying bring, when people arrive with cultural traditions, and I include religion as part of the culture, in a country where religion has been eradicated, literally, from the public sphere, and those are people who grew up with the idea that religion has a place in the public sphere, then you have conflicts. I'm going to tell you an anecdote which is, I think, very telling about how secular France has become. Because we have a need in French schools today to educate educators about the separation of church and state and our concept of laïcité. There are a lot of efforts conducted by the Ministry of Education to train high school teachers on how to deal with the separation of church and state. I was asked by the rectrice of my region, is to say the person who is like a prefect but for education, to address the question of separation of church and state in the United States. And I taught high school teachers about the First Amendment, about the Establishment Clause, about freedom of religion. And the first question came from a 30-year-old professor of philosophy who had an agrégation, so she had 7 years of higher education behind her, said, well, the First Amendment didn't work from what I say here. I said, why didn't the First Amendment not work? She says, because all those people are in church in the States. So the idea was that the separation of church and state was the eradication of religion in the public sphere. So we are a profoundly secular culture I host American students at Sciences Po, and when they ask my students where they can go to church based on whether they're Episcopalians, Catholics, Methodists, or where they can go to a synagogue, and they ask my students look at them and say, I don't know. You know, the one bumper sticker that makes the French laugh is, what would Jesus do? Again, we are like, I don't know, who cares? You know, so more seriously, you have people who grew up in a tradition where there is no such thing as the separation of church and state, where religion is an everyday reality in the public sphere. And they come to a country where we tell them that, for example, in high schools, the Islamic scarf is banned. And it's banned for a very good reason. And I support the ban. High school students, 99% of them are minors. They're not adults. Meaning that in high school, they're under the guardianship of the Republic. Because they're under the guardianship of the Republic, and the Republic is secular, they cannot display, and that's the official title of the law, ostentatious signs of religious belonging. So you can't wear a scarf. You can't wear a big cross. You can't wear a turban if you're a Sikh. You can't wear a yarmulke. Because you're in a Republican school, you're a minor, you're under the guardianship of the Republic. I was the president of my university. I absolutely opposed any idea that we would ban headscarves or other signs of religious belonging in higher education. Why? Because 99% of my students are adults. They make choices, and I'm not their guardian. So that's a different thing. Now, terrorism. This profoundly split the French Republic apart. Why was François Hollande at 8% in terms of approval rate? Not so much because he was incapable of addressing one of the major challenges of French politicians, which is to try and bring the level of unemployment down. The French are skeptical. They don't believe that the magic man is going to snap his fingers and unemployment is going to go down by 2 or 3 points. But where François Hollande lost most of the French left was a few days after the November 2015 attacks in Paris, when he went before Congress, and Congress in France is a very rare occurrence when you meet. So we take the senators and the députés on buses and we transport them to Versailles, where they meet in the castle, and where our jaws all dropped when François Hollande said, we're going to amend the Constitution to provide for stripping dual nationals of their French citizenship in case they were convicted of acts of terrorism. That was the end of whatever love a lot of people on the left felt for François Hollande. Why? First of all, because it's purely symbolical. And I always make the same joke, and I'm going to make it again tonight. Do you think for a minute that those people who walked into the Bataclan that day of November 2015 armed with machine guns and with the intent to kill as many people as possible, would stop on the doorstep and say, "Oh, no, I can't do that. I'm going to lose my French citizenship." So, that's the first point. But the second point, which we all understood immediately, is that who is a dual national in France? Okay, we do have a few French Americans. We do have a few French Germans. We do have a few French Japanese. But more likely, if you have dual citizenship in France, you're French Algerian, you're French Moroccan, you're French Tunisian, you're French Senegalese. There's something, equal protection in the United States. Well, the same thing in France. If you had this improbable situation with a dual national being convicted of an act of terrorism and then stripped of his citizenship, that would be double standards, because someone who is just French couldn't be stripped of his French citizenship, whereas that person who is a dual national would be not only sentenced to 30 years in prison, which is the most severe penalty that France can impose, and then would be stripped of his citizenship, and after 30 years in prison, be probably deported to his home country. Double standards. And double standards against people who primarily are citizens of ex-French colonies, this time, which are essentially Muslim countries. So you don't want to conflate all those issues together. You want to take them one by one, address them in a very serious manner, and see that it's by putting them together, by combining them, that you arrive at a toxic mix. And the toxic mix is whatever rhetoric Marine Le Pen is offering us right now.
We have had the chance today, as I hoped, to both look at the details of the French election and the short run prospects, but also take a look at the underlying factors that are driving French politics and some of the longer run possibilities in French politics. And for that, I would like to very much thank Professor Vincent Michelot.
It's RPR, UMP, or now Les Républicains. And on the left, a coalition anchored around the Socialist Party. So you would have the Conservative Party and then minor parties bringing a few députés that would make it a majority party or majority coalition. Same thing on the left with the Socialist Party. It was a two-party system until the moment when we started moving to a three-party system. Because in the last 5 elections, the National Front, the extreme right party, has never polled less than 20% and more generally at 25%. So we now have a three-party system, and a three-party system which is bizarre because it's a three-party system in which the third party, the National Front, is completely excluded from any kind of significant political representation. That means that a party which polls 20% to 25% in municipal, legislative, European, or regional elections has no power whatsoever, except maybe in the European Parliament, and that's the paradox, because the Front National, or the National Front, is profoundly anti-European. And so the only institution in which the National Front is well represented is the European Parliament. in Strasbourg, and it draws actually a lot of its funds from that important representation in the European Parliament, but it uses those funds to attack the legitimacy of those European institutions. This is one of the problems of French politics. A regime in which 1/4 to 1/5 of the voters never get representation. Again, the National Front, as of today, has 2 representatives in the National Assembly out of 577. The largest city that the Front National won in the municipal election is the great city of Béziers, 40,000 people, and the only claim to fame of Béziers is that its rugby team was the French champion 6 or 7 years in a row in the 1970s, when basically rugby looked like Philadelphia Flyers an NHL game. The Front National does not.
United States, provisionally entitled Weak Parties, Weak Democracies. He's a graduate of École Normale Supérieure de Saint-Cloud. He holds a PhD from the Université de Provence and an habilitation à diriger des recherches from Sciences Po Paris. In Europe, you tend to need like 2 degrees to become a professor. You can't just do it with a PhD. He has duly earned those degrees and has established himself as one of the leading experts in France, certainly, on American politics, and as just a leading scholar and teacher in the field of international relations, and particularly French-American relations. And it is my great pleasure to welcome him to Case Western Reserve to teach us and talk with us. So thank you very much, Vincent.
Great many thanks, dear Joe. It's a labor of friendship because indeed it was a great pleasure to have Joe back in France on that conference which became a book on Obama's first term. And Joe contributed a wonderful piece on healthcare policies, which was pretty welcome at the time, still is. And I'm happy to be able to say that, should I, Joe? That we will have Joe back in Lyon next year to tell us what is new about healthcare in the United States and to tell us and to tell our students. Now, this afternoon I'd like to discuss the recent French elections and the elections to come in the runoff on May 7th in the following order. I'm going to talk to you briefly about the old order. Then I'm going to tell you how that old order has been completely disrupted. Going to go then into what I call the French chaos. And then we might have a few conclusions onto the new order, but let me not be too optimistic. I think we have chaos, but we don't yet have a new order. It all started basically when the French amended the Constitution back in 2000 and made a fateful decision to align the term of the president with the term of the National Assembly. We used to have a 7-year term for the president, a 5-year term for the parliament, and we now have 5 years for the president and 5 years for the parliament.
Well, welcome to the campus of Case Western Reserve University in this really nice Tinkerville University Center. My name is Joe White. I'm professor of political science and public policy and the director of the Center for Policy Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion of the French presidential and actually legislative elections as well, featuring Professor Vincent Michelot from Institut d'études politiques de Lyon, or otherwise known as Sciences Po Lyon. This is one in a series of elections around the world that have been quite interesting. We probably have we have one to come, I think, in Germany soon. But it's a great pleasure to be able to address this election, partly because we're sort of in the middle of it, meaning that the first round occurred Sunday, and then the second round is to come, and then we have the legislative election, which will have a major effect on the kind of government that comes out of this process. And it is, this is one of an occasional series of lectures called the Global Currents Discussions that are made possible by the generous support of Ms. Eloise Briskin, and we'd like to thank her for that. I'd also like to thank people who help organize Center for Policy Studies activities, including our Associate Director, Andrew Lucker, and his brother, Stu Lucker, and my assistant, Anastasia Vinisko, and all of you for coming. I was fortunate enough to meet Professor Michelot back in 2011 when he found me in France because he was putting together a program, a book conference on basically the balance sheet of Obama, how Obama was doing. The book actually came out. It was titled Le Bilan d'Obama. And he recruited me to come give a talk in Lyon. And recently I had reason to go looking for him, and I discovered, guess what? He was in the United States on his sabbatical, teaching at the University of Virginia as a visiting professor. I thought, there's something going on in France. I'd really like to get somebody here to talk about it. Vincent's actually here. So I feel very lucky to have the opportunity to welcome him here to talk about the French election and French politics going forwards. Professor Michelot is professor of American politics at Sciences Po Lyon. I think it's important to remember that this is a school, essentially a school of government and public affairs that begins at the undergraduate level, but it's more comparable to the kinds of schools of public affairs that we have in the United States. He has served on the board. He serves on the board of Fulbright France. He's vice president of the Research Council of the Institut des Amériques. He's a frequent commentator on both French and American politics. He has written widely about U.S. elections, presidential power, and the U.S. Supreme Court. And he is currently at work with Rayla Raja of UMass Amherst on a book about political parties in both France and the United States.
Govern any major city, does not govern any region. We now have 13 regions. They're all governed either by the socialists or by the Conservative Party. But we have, in effect, moved to a three-party regime, and we're now moving to a four-party regime. The old order was also characterized by some kind of a curse. The center always folds. The center never governs. If those of you who are familiar with French politics, and I know some of my compatriots are in the room, know that in the 60s, he was my grandfather's hero. Jean Le Canuet tried to make it into French politics and to make the center a reality. Jean Le Canuet never made it past a secondary cabinet job. Then the next great hope of the center was Jacques Delors. And Jacques Delors decided that he would actually not run for president. He couldn't face the idea that in France, the center had always folded. And then we had François Bayrou. And again, François Bayrou went up to 17% of the vote in the first round of the presidential elections in 2012. And yet, he didn't make it to the runoff. So there is this idea that politics is either on the left or on the right, but you don't exercise power from the center. Today, we're in a state of total disruption. I am totally perplexed, divided by the fact that at the very same time, on Sunday night, we all breathed a big sigh of relief because Marine Le Pen was not in the lead after the first round. And so we were happy. And at the same time, if you consider that 15 years ago, when Jean-Marie Le Pen's face appeared on our screens as one of the two qualifiers for the runoff, that was probably the most catastrophic event in French politics since the German invasion. Our democracy that day had suffered a deadly blow. Today, we put that blow in perspective and say, hey, Jean-Marie, the second major decision that was made at the time, no amendment to the Constitution this time, just ordinary legislation, was to invert the calendar. Had we gone according to the normal calendar, in 2002 we would have had the parliamentary elections first, and then we would have had the presidential elections. The French Parliament decided to invert the calendar and have the presidential elections first, and then the parliamentary elections. Which means that in 2002, 2007, 2012, basically we had exactly the same system. We elected a president, and the French voters, being somewhat rational, every time gave whoever won the presidential election a comfortable majority to govern with in the next 5 years. So that decision to amend the Constitution in 2000 made it impossible for us, technically, to have what we used to call cohabitation or divided government à la française. And we were going to go smoothly, or I would say we were going to slouch into an executive-centered regime where parliamentary elections had become basically rubber stamping the presidential elections, and it was quasi-mechanical or automatic that the newly elected president would get a majority to work with in the National Assembly. Well, this had actually not a stabilizing effect, but a disruptive effect on French politics. Because this kind of sucked the programmatic blood out of the parties, and this was based on a two-party system which was frail to begin with and literally exploded in the last 15 years. The reason is relatively simple. We went from a two-party system, and you're going to tell me, but no, we have a multi-party system in France. But in reality, because of the two rounds of the French presidential elections, and because of the necessity to put together a governing coalition in the French Parliament, we've only had two types of coalitions anchored either on the right by the Conservative Party, whatever its name may be,